Payments Association continues its journey in exploring what are the possibilities of digital currencies, CBDCs, addressing financial inclusion aspects of the society and the countries. And today we have Jennifer Lassiter from the Digital Dollar Project in the US. She is an executive chairman of the Digital Dollar Project. Jennifer, welcome and thank you for sparing time with us. Could you introduce yourself in terms of your role with the Digital Dollar Project, and also talk us through, what is the objective of the program, the project? What are the sort of, successes, the strides that you have achieved, what stage it is in, and then, in terms of the future horizons, what this project aims to achieve.
Wonderful. Yes. And I'm executive director of the Digital Dollar Project. I have a phenomenal executive chairman, the Honorable J. Christopher Giancarlo, who's also a co-founder for the Digital Dollar Project. But Digital Dollar Project is a 501c3, which means it's a registered public charity in the United States. And we exist very simply for open experimentation and data collection for consideration in a US central bank digital currency. And we do this mainly through our pilot program, which is a convening mechanism for the private sector to conduct pilots, testing assumptions and hypotheses for a central bank digital currency. And I like to be very clear when I mention this point around pilots and experimentation, that before we can advocate necessarily for a central bank digital currency, we need to know what we're talking about when we say CBDC, right? And experimentation and generating data that can be used to make decisions around technology and policy choices for central bank digital currencies is the way that we get there. So I'll just make a couple notes for those of you who are familiar with the US landscape. You saw, of course, earlier this year in February, the Federal Reserve System, the central bank for the United States, released a discussion paper out of their policy group around central bank digital currencies that was quickly followed by a technical prototype that was created in partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and MIT's Digital Currency Initiative. And then very quickly after that, we saw an announcement from the executive office, from the president himself, which just by means of quick education and executive order in the United States is a directive from the president to the federal agencies. So what we saw in that executive order was a directive for those agencies mentioned in that order to be able to reallocate resources to start to understand the impact of digital assets, including central bank digital currencies, on the existing payment system in the United States. So I've said the US a bunch, DDP is US focused, but it would be very naive of us not to acknowledge, of course, that one of our goals in this future financial ecosystem is interoperability. And we know that money knows no boundaries. And because of that, of course, the Digital Dollar Project works globally in regards to US CBDC as well as locally. And I think you asked, Ravi, what phase are we in now and what does success look like, which is one of my favorite questions. I grew up professionally working with a user design and technology group. So what problems we're solving and how we measure success is critically important to all of the work that I do, and certainly the lens that I bring to the Digital Dollar Project. So I will just very quickly say, the DDP started in 2020 under my very fearless board of directors. They published a white paper, which can be found on our website, digitaldollarproject.org. They convened a brilliant advisory group, which is international in setting, and they published a set of privacy principles with that advisory group, which can also be found on the website. I joined in November of 2021. We did the very exciting but necessary work of preparing legal documentation for how we're going to conduct our pilots and build our organization. And then in February of this year, we opened up our participant community to the public. So anybody who wants to join DDP can do so. You can find the instructions for joining our membership on our website as well. So in parallel to standing up the organization over the past 6 months, we're also starting that initial investigation work around potential pilots. And again, I was very fortunate that the board had started to do some of that work before I joined. So I was really just picking up on some of those earlier efforts, both wholesale and retail pilots, and working to confirm the legal framework for both of those scenarios as well. So it takes time. I'm sure, as this audience can imagine, particularly takes time when your end user is a consumer, right, or a citizen. There's a lot of delicacy, necessary delicacy around how you're going to engage and conduct an experiment with a consumer population. So with that in mind, I will share one last point, which is that we did just last week have our first announcement around a wholesale pilot. And I believe that is the first pilot to be announced that has originated from the private sector. So Digital Dollar Project, in collaboration with the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, more colloquially known as DTCC, announced last week that we'll be testing the settlement and clearing of securities on a distributed ledger platform. And we'll be looking for potential efficiencies, impact on liquidity, an ability to complete atomic settlement, and a handful of other things. You can also find more detail around that particular pilot on DTCC's website. So hopefully we will have retail announcements before the summer, but we feel like we're moving pretty quickly forward, and the timing, if I go back to the central bank and government announcements in the US earlier this year, is pretty perfect.
Great. Jennifer, could you also give us a little bit flavor about the pilots? I mean, through these pilots, are you looking to just replicate the existing, ways of doing things into the digital world through digital currencies? Or are you also looking at the choice of technologies, any of the new ways of, dealing with money and transacting with money in terms of transfer of
Yeah,
wealth?
it's a wonderful question. And I often say to folks, as you can imagine, there's an ocean of possibilities in terms of what we could test regarding central bank digital currencies and the financial ecosystem. So one of the things that we have to work very hard at, as everyone has limited resources, both at the Digital Dollar Project and with the private sector entities that we're partnering with, is to narrow the scope so that we have the widest scope of impact and applicability. So we anchor in a couple of principles. We anchor in national security, risk, privacy, and financial inclusion, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about later. So I just discussed the DTCC clearing and settlement pilot. That's a wholesale use case. We're also in active discussions for another wholesale pilot, which would create a prototype to examine the feasibility and benefits of a CBDC to issue large volume credits simultaneously and instantly. And that would test, as you can imagine, the existing infrastructure constraints, scalability, and speed for a particular banking institution. For retail use cases, where we've focused more deeply recently, is a pilot to identify and onboard a ring-fenced population to test a simulated CBDC as both a retail transaction medium and a benefits distribution approach. That pilot would simulate a CBDC environment where users could purchase food and essentials with a CBDC at a defined retailer. We are also looking at a retail pilot that prototypes an off-chain payment solution that would use a central bank digital currency and potentially distributed ledger technology. And in that pilot, we'd be looking also to collaborate with a mobile phone provider so we could test capabilities and use some of the lessons learned from that pilot to really examine and look at a humanitarian relief use case. And then finally, I would say cross-border payments, which is probably most familiar to all of us, both because of the costs and the friction associated with cross-border payments, but also something I think that probably touches many of our lives directly. So exploring that cross-border payment solution, again, using CBDC and potentially distributed ledger technology, we would simulate the transfer of the tokenized CBDC from a US-based account to another country. So that could be a country like Mexico or the Philippines, or even the United Kingdom.
Great.
Yeah.
So, Jennifer, while on one side there's a great development and progress happening in terms of adoption of digital, but we know
Mm.
that inequalities within the community still exist. In the UK, there are about close to 1 million people who doesn't have
Yeah.
a bank account, and there's a larger proportion of that, about 13 to 14 million, who are underserved for various reasons. They don't have permanent address. The ID verification, KYC process, and all that keeps them out of it. And then obviously people who are inside it, because of the poverty premium, they are not able to have the affordable financial services and the products. In the US, I believe there are 14 million people without a bank account, and then obviously much bigger who are underserved. So
Mm.
essentially, what are the possibilities with this new era of digital currencies addressing some of these issues and really creating a level playing field within the societies?
Yeah, I love this question. And if it's not brought up proactively in most of the interviews I do, I will bring it up myself, because I believe deeply that while we see so many potential benefits to deploying a central bank digital currency, and again, making many assumptions about what that CBDC might actually look like and what it's capable of doing, but we see these potential benefits, including financial inclusion, but they're not just going to happen. We have to write our own destiny, right? It's important for us to prioritize financial inclusion, or another way to think about it is access for all, right? Universal access. We have to prioritize that while we design this future ecosystem. And if we don't, that is where I fear that we will design for the few. And then we will try to fold in those who have historically not had an opinion in building this system, and not be able to meet their needs. So I will also take a step back and just go a little bit philosophical for a second, which is to say, in a meeting last week, we had a very similar discussion. And what we came to was the concept of a central bank digital currency not only being a relationship between technology and legal frameworks, which it is, right? And that's a very new thing. How do you work with a developer and a lawyer at the table together to figure out the intricacies between the decisions that need to be made from both perspectives? But it is also the hearts and minds of our citizens that need to come along on this journey with us, right? As if you think about it as a full product development team, for my techies that are on this call, right? You need to have all of your stakeholders at the table, and that includes your citizens' voice. So with that sentiment, and also the sentiment that I know we've heard in many other discussions, that money is as much of a social construct as it is a policy decision, is very critical to pay attention to, right? Trust is at the core of establishing that social order and adoption of any societal frameworks that we should put out there. So for a central bank digital currency to work, we need also the private sector as a stakeholder voice at the table. And I don't think that this is unique just to the United States, though I do think the United States is uniquely situated to lead with this private sector voice in the conversation the way that it already is, right? So you can see both the Federal Reserve Board paper that I mentioned earlier had a very lengthy comment period attached to it. They are actively sourcing feedback from the private sector and citizens. Direct citizens can apply. We again saw Project Hamilton with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston release an open CBDC prototype, meaning you can go on to GitHub, hashtag open CBDC, and anyone in the world can touch that code and provide comment around in the shape of a pull request and be a part of the development of that process, right? So we're seeing that feedback loop start to take shape already. I would also challenge that if there are any central banks that are currently designing infrastructure without the private sector, you run the risk of producing something that once it's live, it's not going to work, right? And again, I would say we could see that pretty directly in terms of technical interoperable perspective. But in the United States, I'll speak for the US, we do not unilaterally trust the government or the private sector, right? And to be successful, a central bank digital currency needs both to establish that article of mutual faith. So I just like to really set that stage of why it's important to have such diversity in stakeholder perspectives now in the beginning, the design phases. So we're designing with our users, not for our users. And I think it's a nice segue into financial inclusion and how we measure it, right? And we all know if you look at the data now, and there's a lot of data globally, we're starting slowly to collect some data in the United States, but we know that how each region treats money is different, both from a government perspective and from a citizen's perspective of what their relationship is with money and their trust with money and the government. So really thinking in terms of a US CBDC, how do we define that? How do we define financial inclusion principles? And how do we measure them is a lot of the hard work we're doing now. So the previous question you asked around how we're structuring and measuring success in the pilots, the answer is we're starting really small. We're taking an iterative approach, which helps with resourcing, right? Making sure that we have the right resources for a limited amount of time at the table. But then it also helps us build each phase for each pilot off of the data that's generated from the previous phase. So we can take a slice of however we want to define financial inclusion within a particular pilot. We can run that pilot and we can learn from it. And if it doesn't work, we are learning why it doesn't work and how we need to pivot and change that measurement or that definition as we go forward. So then the last thing that I will say is prioritizing these voices who, again, if you think of a analog system that's been around for over 100 years and barely even touched, was a little bit mind-boggling when you say it that right. Every time I say it, I have to take just one pause. And we're changing it, right? So historically, people who are unbanked or underserved or traditionally their needs have not been met, they've never had a point in the system to help develop the system. It's always been, this is what the system is. How is it not working for you? Let's get you in the system. We are at this very unique and special moment in time where we are designing new infrastructure, right? We're designing potentially new currency that could solve problems in a different way. Being able to elevate the voices of the folks who were not included in the creation of the earlier banking system or the current banking system, and prioritize that as we think about design choices from a policy and a technical perspective is phenomenal. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. But again, it takes intent and it takes time. Because when you're talking about particularly consumers as your end user, again, you're going back to defining trust and helping understand where trust plays in the system. So a couple questions that have bubbled up for us, particularly around financial inclusion and a retail use case, right? Which are questions I'm sure everyone's thinking about. But could a CBDC create more currency movement in the system? Is the convenience of a digital dollar enough to bring individuals who are not currently banked into the system? So for example, if you had a mobile wallet, would the convenience of that mobile wallet prompt someone who otherwise wouldn't want to walk to a physical bank branch to open a savings account and then move digital dollars between that wallet and that savings account without ever having to go into a physical establishment? Right? Other questions. Can we truly establish cost efficiencies that can be felt by an individual sending money cross-border, for example, right? We talked about that cross-border payment. Right now, if you're looking at 15% of monies that you send overseas being carved off for transaction fees, right? Are we able to get that low enough so that it's noticed and felt by those individuals? It's an efficient, cost saving, perhaps more or less frictionless experience for them. So there are many, many examples in this space. Again, I think it's narrowing down on where we have the widest scope of impact right now. But I'd love to get to a place where we're able to be generating pilots and at a large number, and then releasing that data open for consideration both in the United States and elsewhere.
Great. Jennifer, what you said from that, a lot of other questions have popped up in my mind, and let me see where do I want to start. So while on one side, we are trying to do bite-sized pilots, and learn
Mhm.
from that, and really get the ecosystem
Mhm.
together along
Yeah.
this journey. But then you have the market forces on the other side, wherein we see the emergence of crypto in the recent time. And although, most of the purpose is for investment purpose,
Mhm.
but then, there are some countries who are trying it out, countries in crisis, are trying it out as a legal tender and all. So
Right.
once, it'll converge, I believe, in few years' time, and perhaps, no one knows, but I think that maybe both the systems will coexist. In your opinion, then therefore, how these two currencies coexist, the choices with the consumer, and then, when it coexists, what role the bank will undergo a change,
Yeah, I love the way that you framed that, Ravi, because I agree there should be coexisting, right? And I think often when folks want to talk about this, it's a very binary scenario that's presented, right? It's like CBDC or stablecoin, which side are you on, right? Or cryptocurrency and everyone else go home, which I can appreciate the energy right behind the enthusiasts for each of those digital assets. But if I take a step back and we look at the problems we're trying to solve and how much information we have about this very new asset class, right? It's pretty little right now. And in fact, I would even wager that we have a good grasp on what the technology can do right now, but there are many things that the technology will do in the future that we have not even envisioned yet, right? So I go back and I say, okay, the question of whether we have a US central bank digital currency is almost secondary at this point, right? Because right now we're trying to figure out how we exist in a future fully digital world. And that could be that the US decides to have a central bank digital currency and we play in that space, or it could be that we don't, but we know that other countries are doing it and some countries have already done it and are an active pilot phase with their citizenry, right? So, should we choose not to have a US CBDC? What does that look like and what does that mean? So, again, I think not looking at it as a binary scenario because we don't have all the information we need to be able to make data driven decisions, right, around this question. We must experiment and learn, which then makes me very excited to answer this question because we already have some of this technology and some of these assets live right now, right? If you look at stablecoins is a really great example, and USDC, right, which has really just kind of taken off in particular over the past couple of months. So what are they doing and how can we learn from what stable coins are doing and then use that learning to apply to design choices that we're making for central bank digital currencies. So I envision a very near future, hopefully, where there's a menu of options and you have several currency levers and you know which use cases result in which outcomes and then you choose that lever accordingly, right? But in order to understand which use cases are best for which assets, we have to experiment and get the data so that we can draw factual conclusions, right? And then along your comment, Ravi, of eventually, right, we'll see that start to shake out and kind of equal itself out. That to me is the market, right? That's the market. We have the choices, and the market's going to go where there's the most need and there's the most drive to solve the right problems. And so I agree with you. We set up, we learn from what's live right now. We pay that forward into central bank digital currencies, which is going to take a long time, right? We're not talking about 12 months and we're going to have a US CBDC. We're talking about a couple of years if we move quickly and efficiently and make a decision to deploy before we would have something even in a test mode, I imagine, out of the Federal Reserve System. So what do we learn in the meantime? How do we pay that forward into CBDC research? And then we let the market figure out what's going to survive, right? What's going to flourish and what's going to survive. I will say one of the things that's going to be most interesting to watch develop, and when I think about Web3 at large, right, is the user interface around these assets. Because my mom is not going to be like, I think I want to use a stable coin for this purchase, but on this purchase, I'd like to use a CBDC. Oh, and by the way, we still have cash in circulation, so I'll also use cash over here. We're going to have to work very intentionally around education and adoption and a user interface that makes the use of whichever currency seamless. And I think we are starting to see that from user research, actually both in Europe and the United States, where what consumers are looking for is that easy, seamless, frictionless engagement with whatever platform they should decide to choose that should move their money in whatever form that money should take. So that I think answers the question around coexistence. I think the second piece around will it change the role of the bank is absolutely. And I don't think that should be a scary thing. I think that what we're talking about and what you had mentioned, Robbie, in the beginning, moving from an analog system to a digital system, like even if that's the only thing that happens, no US CBDC, but we're modernizing from an analog system to a digital system, that alone will affect the infrastructure needed to support the movement of the asset, regardless of its type, and will have impact on our banking system, right? So I think there's a quote, right, that says the only thing that's predictable is change, or change is the only thing that's inevitable, right? Something along those lines. So I think that's the same here. It's understand what is changing, touch the tech now. This would be my call to action. Touch the tech now, do it through pilots and experimentation as open and collaboratively as possible. And that's going to help you understand what the potential impact might be on your business, as well as give you a seat at the table as we're developing this future open interoperable system. The last thing I would imagine that a bank would want is to show up in that conversation once these decisions have already been made and have to figure out how to conform, versus being able to be, again, that voice at the table that helps design what that system looks like before it comes to fruition.
Mhm. So, I think you already covered some of the points of the questions that I'm about to ask, but then still, I mean, in terms of you mentioned trust, the proof of the pudding of any new concept is, once it is adopted, and for that, I think, we need to build a trust. But then, we are also living in a multi-generational sort of consumer base where we have digital natives and digital migrants, and there's still a significant amount of population who are not very comfortable with using digital things. So the thing is, what's the kind of approach towards building this trust and kind of the consumer protection framework, governance and framework around it?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I did talk about trust before, and I think it's intricately related to privacy. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. First, I want to say what I appreciate about a central bank digital currency is that if you look at this suite, right, of digital assets, all the way from cryptocurrencies, on one end, highly volatile, to central bank digital currencies, this is where you're going to find the safer digital asset, right? And the reason for that is it's because it's the only digital asset that in the United States would be 1 for 1 for a US dollar, right? It's issued by the Federal Reserve System and it lives on the Federal Reserve ledger. So in that sense, it's very different from a stable coin and a cryptocurrency. And the reason I think that's so important to call out again is because the adoption of any new currency shape or form is going to be dependent on trust. And I believe if you start to look again at some of the early research that came out of Project Hamilton as they were looking at how to define and measure trust and financial inclusion for the development of their prototype, what you were really starting to see is that privacy was very important, but the definition of privacy was variable. So it gets very complex as you think, well, if there's so many different factors that weigh into how someone defines privacy, how would you design a central bank digital currency with privacy kind of at the forefront in terms of a design principle that you're considering? And does that come in tension with financial inclusion principles as you're also prioritizing that component for some of your design choices? And I think if you take a step back and you break down kind of the legal components of privacy and how we think about privacy in the United States through the US Constitution, right, we would look towards our Fourth Amendment. And what we're seeing play out in very real time right now, and actually this is a fantastic use case also in Europe around big tech and looking at how big tech, are not government entities, are not held accountable, at least in the US, from a constitutional framework. And we're still trying to figure out what that legal accountability might look like and how we would apply, again, a rule of law that perhaps was designed during a time where we didn't have a digital system that we were taking into account, but the same principles apply for central bank digital currencies. So I would make the argument that we would want to have it because it's the least volatile, right, of the asset classes. So it's safe money for our citizenry to invest in. And then two, if we prioritize privacy in the right way, we'll be able to reestablish trust with some of the citizenry where that trust is broken. And I think, again, that would be being very open and transparent about the protocols that are being used for a central bank digital currency, who is in charge, who collects which data. The Digital Dollar Project believes, along with the Federal Reserve paper, which mentioned this as well, that we maintain a two-tier the two-tier banking system that we have now. So that would create some separation in terms of who's collecting the data. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is what happens when the system is broken. And this, again, is where I call back to that big tech scenario. If a central bank digital currency is not in existence, and we see the use of stablecoins and cryptocurrencies, what legal framework holds the holders of those assets accountable? In a scenario with a central bank digital currency, your government is accountable to the US Constitution, and we have privacy protections as citizens from our government that could be encoded and accounted for when we think of governance and standards of a central bank digital currency. So I just to come full circle on why necessarily a CBDC and how do we start to rebuild trust and adoption? I think we give people the opportunity to have their voice through pilots, through data generation. We intentionally focus on those communities whose needs have not traditionally been met by the banking system. We are open and transparent about what conversations are happening. Again, I've been really impressed by the way that the Federal Reserve System has been leading in this space. And we provide an opportunity, again, for that comment and participation. And I think finally, right, it is making sure that we have the right legal frameworks in place to protect citizens, not only from the technology and what we know it's able to do now, because we don't legislate tech, right? We legislate outcomes. So what could those potential outcomes be in the future, both positive and negative, and how would we want to account for them in that legal framework?
Great.
It's that easy, Ravi.
Thank you so much for not making it look scary. But then You have given us a lot of perspectives on this topic, and it is quite exciting. A lot of things are happening at the same time. Web 3.0, cryptocurrencies, and the new CBDCs. So, any final thoughts in terms of your belief in this initiative? How what sort of positive impacts it will have? Any final thoughts, Jennifer?
Mm, final thoughts, I guess, is just a call to action. And I think as humans, right, and humans run all of our institutions, private and public, um, there's a natural reaction, I think, to step back and from change, right? And particularly from disruptive change. And there's no way that our new world of digital assets is not going to be disruptive, right? It's happening now. We're seeing disruption now. So I would just really encourage people to figure out how to be a part of that conversation. And it could be joining a group that's working on it and just standing in the back and listening and educating yourselves and taking that internally for discussion. Totally acceptable, all the way to the other end, which are entities that are actively piloting, that are making public statements about it, that are, potentially lobbying their government or educating their government. There's a role for everyone. And I think we only create the best product when we have all of the voices at the table throughout the entire life cycle of the development of that product, right? So we're going to stumble. I think that's healthy. Again, data driven decision making, as much as we can keep this kind of anchored in a place of what problems are we trying to solve and what technology gets us there, we'll be moving in a good direction. But yes, I think open, transparent, get involved. All of these things are calls to action that I would ask any of these listeners to be a part of. And even if you don't want to do it in a group format, you can go to GitHub's Open CBDC and you can start to play around with the code there, right? So we saw the announcement that Bank of England and the Bank of Canada has also joined the MIT initiative. So again, we're looking at that collaborative space where we're designing together and we know what interoperable looks like. If anybody wants to do a pilot with Digital Dollar Project and you're not a US based company, email me. We have a lot of opportunity, again, for cross-border piloting. And we would love to be able to do that with a variety of different jurisdictions. But stay engaged and, sometimes have fun with it. That's part of the fun of experimentation, right? Exploring the art of the possible. And yeah, I think that's all. But thank you, Ravi. That's I love that question. It's a dreamer's question.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.